It all started with a garden, a small, quiet sanctuary nestled behind the tall, weathered brick walls of an old suburban home. Jerome had spent years transforming his backyard into a lush, thriving oasis, a place where the chaos of the world seemed to melt away, where the soft rustle of leaves and the gentle hum of bees provided a soothing soundtrack to his thoughts. It was his refuge, his sanctuary, his piece of paradise carved out of the hard concrete and manicured lawns of the HOA-controlled neighborhood. Jerome wasn't the type to seek attention. He was a quiet, unassuming man in his late 40s, a former Marine turned history teacher, known to his students as the gentle giant, tall, broad-shouldered, with a deep, calming voice that commanded respect without ever needing to raise it. He had moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago, looking for a peaceful place to settle down after decades of service. He had chosen this house specifically for its spacious backyard, perfect for the garden he had always dreamed of building. Over the years, he had transformed that empty, weed-choked plot into a thriving ecosystem. Rows of fragrant lavender swaying gently in the breeze, towering sunflowers stretching their faces toward the sun, bright, fiery chili peppers hanging like ornaments from dark green vines. He had even built a small, koi-filled pond in one corner, the crystal-clear water alive with flashes of orange and white as the fish darted between the smooth, carefully placed stones. It was his pride and joy, a place where he could unwind after a long day, his fingers digging into the cool, dark soil as he pruned, watered, and nurtured each plant with the same patience and dedication that had carried him through his military career. It was a piece of him, a living testament to his resilience, his determination, his quiet strength. And then came Karen. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, a sideways glance over the fence as she walked her perfectly groomed poodle past his house, the tight, disapproving purse of her lips as she caught sight of the thick, tangled vines creeping up the side of his brick wall. Jerome had noticed her lingering at the edge of his property more and more often in recent weeks. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw set in a tight, judgmental line, as if the sight of his garden physically pained her. Then, one bright Saturday morning, as Jerome knelt by his rose bushes, carefully snipping away the dead leaves and overgrown stems, he heard the sharp, staccato click of high heels on his driveway. He glanced up, his hand freezing mid-cut as Karen strode purposefully toward him, her crisp white blouse and pastel pink blazer a stark contrast to the rich, earthy tones of his garden. "Good morning," she said, her voice sharp and clipped, her eyes hidden behind oversized, dark sunglasses. She crossed her arms over her chest, her fingers tapping impatiently against her forearm as if she had a million better things to do than stand in his driveway. "Morning," Jerome replied, his voice calm, the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft chirping of birds providing a peaceful backdrop to the tense, sudden confrontation. He straightened slowly, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his gloved hand, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her stiff, uncomfortable posture. Karen hesitated for a moment, her jaw tightening as if she were physically biting back the urge to launch into a tirade. Finally, she took a deep breath, tilting her chin up in a gesture that might have been regal if it weren't so transparently forced. "I've noticed your garden," she said, her nose wrinkling slightly as her gaze flicked over the dense, overgrown greenery that covered nearly every inch of his backyard. "It's rather unkempt." Jerome felt a flicker of irritation flare in his chest, but he kept his face carefully neutral, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "Unkempt," he echoed, his voice steady, his deep, resonant tone cutting through the quiet morning air like a blade. "I call it natural, organic, alive." Karen's lips thinned, her fingers tightening around her forearm. "It's messy," she snapped, her carefully maintained facade of politeness slipping for a brief, telling moment. "And it's an eyesore. The HOA has received several complaints about the condition of your property, and I've been asked to address it." Jerome felt his jaw tighten, the familiar, simmering anger that had carried him through countless battles in his past slowly rising to the surface. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm, to keep his voice even, measured. "Complaints? From who?" Karen hesitated, her eyes flicking away for a brief, telling moment before snapping back to his, her posture stiffening defensively. I'm not at liberty to disclose that, she said, her tone icy. But as the president of the HOA, it's my duty to ensure that all properties within this neighborhood adhere to the community guidelines. And your jungle clearly does not. Jerome felt a bitter, mocking laugh bubble up in his chest, but he swallowed it down, his broad shoulders stiffening as he met her icy glare with one of his own. My garden is on my property, he said, his voice low, steady, his eyes never leaving hers. And as far as I'm concerned, what I do with my own land is my business, not yours. For a brief, fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of uncertainty pass behind her dark sunglasses, a tiny crack in her carefully maintained mask of superiority. But then she straightened, her chin tilting up defiantly as she took a step closer, her heels clicking sharply against the warm, sunlit concrete. Consider this your first and final warning, she said, her voice cold, her words clipped. Clean up this mess, or the HOA will take action. With that, she turned on her heel, her pastel blazer flaring dramatically around her as she marched back down the driveway, her poodle yapping excitedly at her heels as if sensing her simmering anger. Jerome watched her retreat, his fists clenched, his jaw tight, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had faced down worse than Karen in his lifetime, far worse. But as he watched her disappear around the corner, her sharp, staccato footsteps echoing off the brick walls of his home, he felt a quiet, simmering rage begin to burn in his chest. He had fought for his country, for his freedom, for his right to live his life on his own terms. He would not be intimidated, bullied, or pushed into submission by someone like Karen. As he turned back to his garden, the soft rustle of the wind through the leaves whispering in his ears, he made a silent, unspoken vow. He would not back down, not this time. The battle for his peaceful garden had just begun. The days following Karen's first confrontation passed in a tense, simmering silence. Jerome returned to his garden, his hands moving methodically through the soil, his muscles tight with the residual anger of their encounter. He found solace in the rhythmic, calming work of pruning, planting, and watering, the rich, loamy scent of the earth filling his lungs as he tried to shake off the bitter taste of their conversation. But the peace didn't last. A week after their initial clash, Jerome found a crisp, white envelope wedged into his mailbox, the neat, blocky letters of the HOA's official seal stamped in bright blue ink across the front. He tore it open, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the densely printed text inside. Notice of violation, property aesthetics compliance. The letter accused him of violating several HOA regulations, including excessive vegetation, unauthorized water features, and failure to maintain uniform landscaping standards. It concluded with a stern warning that he had exactly 30 days to bring his property into compliance, or face escalating fines and potential legal action. Jerome felt his jaw clench, his fingers tightening around the letter as a slow, burning rage flared in his chest. He had expected this. Karen's thinly veiled threat to clean up this mess had all but guaranteed it. But seeing the words in black and white, the cold, impersonal language of bureaucracy weaponized against him, hit harder than he had anticipated. He tossed the letter onto his kitchen counter, the crisp paper skidding across the smooth surface before coming to a rest against the fruit bowl, its bright, accusatory text glaring up at him like a challenge. He took a deep breath, his broad chest rising and falling with the effort, his pulse thundering in his ears as he tried to calm the storm of emotions roiling inside him. He had been through worse. Far worse. He had faced down enemy fire, huddled in freezing, mud-soaked trenches, his breath fogging in the icy air as bullets whistled past his ears. He had watched friends bleed out on foreign soil, their final, gasping breaths hanging like ghosts in the air around him. He had survived, and he would survive this. But as the days passed, the pressure began to mount. A few days after the letter arrived, Jerome noticed the first of the surveillance cameras. It was small, barely noticeable at first glance, its matte black casing blending seamlessly into the tall, wrought iron fence that separated his property from the rest of the neighborhood. But once he spotted it, he couldn't unsee it. The tiny, glass eye peering down at his garden, its unblinking gaze a constant, silent presence in his once peaceful sanctuary. Then came the noise complaints. Jerome had always taken care to keep his gardening activities to reasonable hours. Early mornings, quiet afternoons, never past sunset. But suddenly, the HOA began issuing warnings for excessive noise and disturbing the peace, the neatly typed letters arriving in his mailbox with irritating regularity, their sharp, impersonal language a constant, nagging reminder that he was being watched. He found himself glancing over his shoulder more and more often as he worked, his fingers tightening around the wooden handles of his tools as he caught glimpses of movement in the windows of the houses that bordered his yard, shadows flickering behind drawn curtains, blinds snapping shut the moment he looked up, the faint, distant murmur of whispered conversations drifting on the breeze. It was a subtle, insidious form of psychological warfare, and Jerome felt his patience wearing thin, his normally calm, steady demeanor cracking under the relentless pressure. He had always considered himself a peaceful man, a man of quiet strength and unshakable resolve. But Karen was pushing him to his breaking point, her petty, passive-aggressive campaign of harassment gnawing at his nerves like a slow, relentless drip of water against stone. But the final straw came one sunny Saturday morning, as Jerome knelt beside his koi pond, carefully arranging a cluster of smooth, polished river stones around the edge of the water, his reflection shimmering in the glassy surface as the bright orange and white fish darted around his hands. He had just finished positioning the last stone when he heard the sharp, staccato click of high heels on concrete, the sound echoing off the brick walls of his house like gunfire. He looked up, his brow furrowing as Karen marched down his driveway, her perfectly styled blonde hair gleaming in the harsh sunlight, her dark sunglasses reflecting his startled expression as she came to a stop at the edge of his lawn. She paused for a moment, her nostrils flaring slightly as she took in the sight of his garden, the lush, sprawling greenery, the vibrant, untamed colors, the gentle, soothing burble of the koi pond, before letting out a sharp, dismissive huff, her fingers tightening around the leather strap of her designer handbag. "Morning," she said, her voice as sharp and brittle as the heels of her expensive shoes. "I see you've chosen to ignore the HOA's warnings." Jerome rose slowly, his tall, broad frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the sunlit grass as he met her glare with one of his own. "My garden," he said, his voice low and steady, "is my business, and as long as it's on my property, it's none of yours." Karen's lips thinned, a faint, pink flush creeping up her pale cheeks as she straightened, her chin tilting up in a defiant, almost regal gesture. "We'll see about that," she snapped, her voice dripping with barely contained fury. "You have 30 days to bring this jungle into compliance, or the HOA will be forced to take more aggressive action." With that, she spun on her heel, her designer handbag swinging dramatically around her side as she marched back down the driveway, her sharp, staccato footsteps echoing off the brick walls of his house as she disappeared around the corner, her final, parting words hanging like a dark, ominous cloud in the warm, sunlit air. Jerome watched her go, his fists clenching at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he felt the quiet, simmering rage he had been holding back for weeks finally begin to boil over. He had tried to be patient, to ignore her petty, power-hungry games, to focus on the peace and solitude of his garden. But Karen had just crossed a line, and Jerome had no intention of backing down now. The war for his garden and his peace had just become personal. Jerome spent the days after Karen's second confrontation in a state of simmering, tightly controlled anger. His peaceful garden, once a refuge from the chaos of the outside world, now felt like a contested battleground, each blooming flower and carefully arranged stone a silent, defiant statement against the HOA's creeping encroachment. He had built this sanctuary with his own two hands, poured years of sweat and effort into transforming the barren plot into a lush, thriving ecosystem, and he would be damned if he let someone like Karen tear it all down. He spent the next few evenings sitting at his kitchen table, his laptop glowing softly in the dim light as he combed through the HOA bylaws, his fingers tapping steadily against the worn, wooden surface as he highlighted sections, made notes, and drafted responses. He had never been one for paperwork. The smell of fresh soil, the feeling of rough bark beneath his fingers, the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind, these were the things that brought him peace. But if Karen wanted a war of words, he would meet her on her own turf. The following Monday, Jerome made his first move. He composed a carefully worded email to the HOA board, outlining the steps he had taken to maintain his property in accordance with the community guidelines, attaching high-resolution photos of his garden, his koi pond, and the meticulously trimmed hedges that lined his driveway. He included a copy of the property survey he had commissioned when he first bought the house, clearly marking the boundaries of his land, and firmly but politely requested that the board cease their baseless harassment. He hit send with a sharp, satisfied click, leaning back in his chair as the message vanished from his screen, a small, symbolic victory in his ongoing battle for his backyard. But even as he closed his laptop, the faint, distant rumble of an approaching car drew his attention back to the window, his dark eyes narrowing as he caught sight of the sleek, black SUV pulling up to his curb. He rose slowly, his tall, broad frame casting a long shadow across the sunlit kitchen floor as he made his way to the front door, his pulse quickening as the engine cut off and the driver's side door creaked open. He stepped out onto the porch just in time to see a short, stocky man in a crisp, dark suit step onto the sidewalk, a thin, leather-bound notebook clutched in one hand, his sharp, calculating eyes scanning the front of Jerome's house with the detached, appraising air of a predator sizing up its prey. The man paused at the bottom of Jerome's driveway, his head tilting slightly as he caught sight of the tall, muscular figure looming in the doorway, his expression flickering briefly with what might have been hesitation before he straightened, his shoulders squaring as he took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Morning," the man said, his voice smooth, polished, his tone dripping with the false, practiced politeness of a used car salesman. "My name is Richard, and I'm here on behalf of the HOA. I was hoping to have a word with you about your landscaping." Jerome crossed his arms over his broad chest, his jaw tightening as he took a slow, measured breath, the cool morning air filling his lungs as he met the man's steely gaze with one of his own. "What about it?" Richard hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly around the leather cover of his notebook as he flipped it open, his eyes flicking down to the neatly typed pages within. "We've received a number of complaints," he said, his tone carefully neutral, his eyes never quite meeting Jerome's, "regarding the condition of your yard. Overgrown vegetation, unapproved water features, unauthorized structures. It's a bit of an eyesore, frankly." Jerome felt his fists clench at his sides, the sharp, metallic taste of anger rising in his throat as he took a slow, deliberate step down the porch steps, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path as he closed the distance between them. "My garden," he said, his voice low and steady, his dark eyes locked onto Richard's, "is my property. It's well within my legal boundaries, and it's not hurting anyone. If you have a problem with it, I suggest you take it up with my lawyer." Richard's eyes widened slightly, his thin, neatly trimmed mustache twitching with barely concealed surprise as he took a half step back, his polished leather shoes scuffing against the rough concrete of the driveway. He opened his mouth to reply, but whatever words he had prepared seemed to catch in his throat, his thin, carefully rehearsed smile faltering for a brief, telling moment before he snapped his notebook shut with a sharp, irritated flick of his wrist. "Very well," he said, his tone suddenly colder, sharper, his eyes narrowing as he took a step back, his shoulders stiffening defensively. "But don't say I didn't warn you. The HOA has a vested interest in maintaining property values, and we won't hesitate to take legal action if necessary." With that, he turned on his heel, his dark suit flaring dramatically around him as he marched back to his SUV, the faint, irritated creak of the leather seats echoing across the quiet, sunlit street as he climbed inside and slammed the door behind him. The engine roared to life, the tires kicking up a small cloud of dust as the vehicle sped off down the street, its taillights flashing briefly before disappearing around the corner. Jerome watched him go, his pulse still pounding in his ears, his fists still clenched at his sides as he slowly turned back to his house, the quiet, rhythmic chirping of the crickets in his garden suddenly feeling far too loud, too close. He had expected pushback, had known from the moment Karen first darkened his doorstep that this battle would not be won easily. But the sight of that sleek, black SUV, the cold, calculating eyes of the man who had stepped out of it, the thinly veiled threat hidden beneath his polished, practiced words, it all felt like a warning, a signal that the real fight was just beginning. Jerome took a deep, steadying breath, his broad shoulders rising and falling as he felt the slow, steady burn of defiance reignite in his chest. He had come too far, worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let someone like Karen or her polished, pencil-pushing lackeys tear it all down. The stakes had just been raised, and Jerome had no intention of backing down now. Jerome watched the black SUV disappear around the corner, his mind racing with 1,000 silent, angry thoughts. He had tried to be patient, to handle this escalating conflict with the quiet, restrained dignity that had defined his life for decades. But the thinly veiled threats, the constant surveillance, the relentless stream of letters and warnings, it was all starting to wear him down, to fray the carefully maintained edges of his calm. That night, as he sat alone in his kitchen, the dim light from the overhead fixture casting long, jagged shadows across the worn wooden table, he made a decision. If Karen and her polished, corporate enforcers wanted a fight, then he would give them one, but on his terms, not theirs. The next morning, Jerome rose early, the first hints of dawn painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange as he pulled on his heavy work gloves and stepped out into the cool, dew-covered grass of his backyard. The air was crisp and fresh, the faint, earthy scent of wet soil and blooming flowers filling his lungs as he moved methodically through his garden, his hands steady and sure as he pruned, trimmed, and arranged his plants with the same precision he had once applied to his military drills. But as he worked, a new, sharper edge crept into his movements. Each clipped branch, each carefully placed stone a silent, defiant declaration of his intent. He had been content to live quietly, to keep to himself, to let the world pass him by. But Karen had dragged him into this battle, forced his hand, and now he would show her just how dangerous it was to underestimate a man who had already faced far greater challenges than a petty, power-hungry HOA president. By the time the sun had fully risen, its warm, golden rays casting long, dramatic shadows across the garden, Jerome had transformed his small, secluded oasis into something far more imposing. He had reinforced the thick, ivy-covered lattice that lined the back of his property, weaving strands of dense, thorny blackberry vines through the wooden slats like barbed wire, their sharp, needle-like thorns glinting in the morning light. He had carefully rearranged the rows of bright, blooming sunflowers that lined the edge of his koi pond, positioning them like sentinels, their tall, sturdy stalks swaying gently in the breeze as they turned their faces toward the rising sun. He had even added a row of dense, towering bamboo along the far side of his yard, the thick, green shoots creating a natural, impenetrable barrier that all but blocked the view of his property from the street. It was a statement, a bold, unspoken challenge, a silent declaration of war, and he had no doubt that Karen would take notice. His suspicions were confirmed later that afternoon, as he stood on his front porch, wiping the sweat from his brow and admiring his handiwork, when the familiar, high-pitched click of high heels on concrete echoed down his driveway. He turned slowly, his dark eyes narrowing as Karen strode purposefully toward him, her sharp, angular features twisted into a mask of barely contained rage, her perfectly manicured fingers clenched tightly around the leather strap of her designer handbag. She came to a stop at the edge of his lawn, her chest heaving slightly as she struggled to catch her breath, her pale cheeks flushed with a combination of heat and fury. For a long, tense moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the soft, whispering rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant, lazy hum of a passing lawnmower. Finally, Karen took a deep, shuddering breath, her sharp, blue eyes narrowing behind her oversized, dark sunglasses as she jabbed a perfectly manicured finger toward the towering wall of bamboo that now lined the edge of Jerome's property. "What is this?" she snapped, her voice sharp, brittle, her words dripping with barely contained fury. "What do you think you're doing, Jerome? This jungle is a violation of every HOA guideline on the books." Jerome felt his lips curl into a slow, satisfied smile, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly as he crossed his arms over his broad chest, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "Just making a few improvements," he replied, his tone calm, measured, his deep, rumbling voice carrying easily across the warm, sunlit lawn. "Thought I'd add a bit of privacy. You know, for my peace of mind." Karen's jaw clenched, her perfectly straight, white teeth grinding together audibly as she struggled to find a response, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched her handbag like a lifeline. This is a blatant violation," she stammered, her voice rising an octave as her carefully constructed composure began to crack, her thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a furious scowl. "You can't just plant whatever you want, wherever you want. There are rules, Jerome, and you will follow them." Jerome took a slow, deliberate step closer, his shadow falling across Karen's pale, trembling form as he leaned in, his deep, dark eyes locked onto hers with a cold, unflinching intensity that sent a faint, involuntary shiver down her spine. "If you have a problem with my garden," he said, his voice low, steady, each word carefully enunciated, "then take it up with the board. I've already sent them my response. I have every right to plant what I want, where I want, on my own property. And unless you have a court order, there's nothing you or your little cronies can do about it." Karen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her pale, trembling lips struggling to form a coherent response as she took a half-step back, her sharp, designer heels scraping against the rough concrete of the driveway. For a brief, fleeting moment, Jerome thought he saw the faintest flicker of fear in her icy, blue eyes, a tiny crack in the polished, unshakable mask of superiority she had worn so confidently for so long. Without another word, she spun on her heel, her pastel blazer flaring dramatically around her as she marched back down the driveway, her sharp, staccato footsteps echoing off the brick walls of Jerome's house as she disappeared around the corner, her final, parting words hanging like a dark, ominous cloud in the warm, sunlit air. "You'll regret this, Jerome," she hissed over her shoulder, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "I promise you, you'll regret this." Jerome watched her go, his fists clenched at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as the faint, distant sound of her retreating footsteps slowly faded into silence. He had expected pushback, had known from the moment Karen first darkened his doorstep that this battle would not be won easily, but he had no intention of backing down now. As he turned back to his garden, the thick, thorny vines rustling gently in the warm, summer breeze, he felt a quiet, simmering satisfaction settle in his chest. Karen had crossed a line, and he would not be intimidated, bullied, or pushed into submission. The real fight was just beginning. Jerome stood on his porch, the morning sunlight casting sharp, angular shadows across his freshly fortified garden. He watched Karen's retreating form disappear around the corner, her sharp, staccato footsteps still echoing in his ears long after she had vanished from sight. He took a deep, steadying breath, his broad shoulders rising and falling as he slowly unclenched his fists, his pulse still racing from their latest confrontation. He had known, from the moment he first laid eyes on her, that Karen would not back down easily. She had the stubborn, self-righteous determination of someone who had never truly been challenged, never faced real opposition, never been forced to confront the limits of her own authority. But Jerome was different. He had been forged in the fires of adversity, shaped by years of hardship and struggle, and he had no intention of surrendering his hard-won peace without a fight. As he stepped back inside, the cool, dim air of his kitchen a welcome contrast to the oppressive heat of the sunlit yard, Jerome felt a quiet, simmering determination settle in his chest. He had spent years building this sanctuary, transforming it from a barren, weed-choked plot into a thriving, vibrant oasis, and he would be damned if he let someone like Karen tear it all down out of sheer spite. He spent the next few days reinforcing his defenses, adding another layer of thick, thorn-covered vines to the lattice along his back fence, weaving the sharp, twisted branches through the wooden slats like a living, breathing barrier against the outside world. He carefully rearranged his flower beds, positioning the tall, bright sunflowers like silent sentinels along the edge of his property, their golden faces turned defiantly toward the sun, as if daring anyone to challenge their right to bloom. But even as he worked, his mind raced with 1,000 silent, angry thoughts, his normally calm, methodical demeanor cracking under the relentless pressure of Karen's escalating campaign. He knew, deep down, that she would not stop, that as long as she believed she held the upper hand, she would continue to push, to probe, to test the limits of his patience until he either broke or surrendered. Then, one quiet, starlit evening, as Jerome sat on his back porch, his rough, calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee, he caught sight of a flicker of movement at the edge of his property. He set his mug down slowly, his dark eyes narrowing as he peered through the thick, tangled vines that lined his fence, his pulse quickening as he caught a brief, shadowy glimpse of someone moving among the trees, their pale, ghostly form barely visible in the faint, silvery glow of the moonlight. Jerome rose slowly, his tall, muscular frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the dew-covered grass as he stepped off the porch, his bare feet sinking into the cool, damp earth as he moved silently toward the edge of his property, his breath coming in slow, steady bursts as he slipped between the thick, twisted branches of the blackberry vines. He crept closer, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, his heart thudding in his chest as he caught the faint, distant rustle of leaves, the soft, almost imperceptible crunch of gravel beneath hurried footsteps. He paused, his pulse thundering in his ears as he strained to hear, his hands tightening into fists at his sides as he felt the sharp, familiar thrill of adrenaline surge through his veins. Then, suddenly, the shadows parted, and Jerome found himself face to face with a pale, trembling figure, their wide, frightened eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, their thin, pale lips parted in a silent, gasping breath as they stumbled backward, their hands raised defensively, as if expecting a blow. For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved, the only sound the soft, whispering rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant, rhythmic chirping of the crickets that had begun to emerge from their hiding places as the temperature dropped. Then, finally, the figure spoke, their voice low, trembling, their words dripping with fear and desperation. "Please," they whispered, their eyes flicking nervously between Jerome's towering form and the thick, thorn-covered vines that loomed behind him like the jagged, twisted teeth of a predator. "I didn't mean to. I had to see for myself." Jerome frowned, his broad, dark brows knitting together in confusion as he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his bare feet crunching softly against the gravel path as he leaned in, his dark eyes locked onto the figure's pale, trembling face. "See what?" he growled, his deep, rumbling voice cutting through the still, silent air like a blade. "What are you doing on my property?" The figure flinched, their thin, trembling fingers clutching at the fabric of their shirt as they stumbled backward, their eyes wide and frightened, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps as they struggled to find their voice. "It's not what you think," they stammered, their words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed rush, their eyes flicking nervously to the thick, towering bamboo that lined the far side of Jerome's yard. I had to see. I had to know if the rumors were true." Jerome felt a slow, simmering anger rise in his chest, his fists clenching at his sides as he took another step forward, his dark, imposing shadow falling across the trembling figure like a shroud. "What rumors?" he growled, his voice low, dangerous, his eyes narrowing as he caught the faint, familiar scent of perfume drifting on the cool, night air. "What are you talking about?" The figure hesitated, their wide, frightened eyes darting back and forth as if searching for an escape route, their thin, pale lips trembling with the effort of holding back a terrified sob. Then, finally, they broke, their shoulders slumping, their head bowing in defeat as they whispered, their voice low, trembling, their words barely audible above the faint, distant rustle of the wind through the trees. "It's Karen." They choked, their voice cracking with a mixture of fear and shame. "She's been lying to us, to all of us. She's not who she says she is." Jerome felt his breath catch in his throat, his heart thudding painfully in his chest as the figure's words echoed through his mind, their dark, ominous implications settling like a cold, heavy weight in the pit of his stomach. He had known, from the very beginning, that Karen was hiding something, that her relentless, obsessive campaign against him was driven by something far deeper, far darker, than mere petty spite. But this was something else entirely. As he stood there, the cool, night air whispering through the tangled branches of the blackberry vines, Jerome felt a slow, grim smile spread across his lips, his dark eyes glinting with a mixture of anger and anticipation as he realized that the real fight, the final, decisive battle was about to begin. Jerome stood in the shadows, his heart still racing from the unexpected encounter at the edge of his property. The stranger's words echoed in his mind, each syllable a sharp, jagged piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized he'd been piecing together all along. She's been lying to us, to all of us. She's not who she says she is. He felt a slow, simmering anger rise in his chest, his fists clenching at his sides as he turned and made his way back to his house. The cool, damp grass whispering beneath his bare feet as the distant, rhythmic chirping of the crickets filled the air around him. He had suspected, from the very beginning, that there was more to Karen's relentless campaign against him than mere property disputes and power games. But this felt different. This felt personal. He spent the next few days quietly gathering information, his sharp, dark eyes scanning every document, every email, every piece of correspondence he had ever received from the HOA, searching for the faintest hint of deception, the smallest crack in the carefully constructed facade that Karen had built around herself. He called in a few favors from old friends, former colleagues who still moved in the shadowy world of private investigators and security consultants, their whispered conversations over the phone filled with hints, warnings, and veiled implications. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. Karen was not the pristine, law-abiding, upstanding citizen she pretended to be. She had a past, a dark, twisted past filled with fraudulent business dealings, bankruptcies, and shady real estate transactions that had left countless families homeless and destitute. She had reinvented herself, scrubbed her record clean, and used her position as HOA president to build a new life, a new identity, a new lie. Jerome felt a cold, grim satisfaction settle in his chest as he compiled his findings, his fingers flying over the keys of his laptop as he pieced together the tangled web of deceit that Karen had woven around herself, each new revelation adding fuel to the slow, steady burn of anger that had been building in his chest for weeks. Finally, the night before the next HOA meeting, Jerome made his final move. He printed out copies of the documents he had uncovered, the financial records, the court transcripts, the damning emails that revealed Karen's true nature, and carefully placed them in a thick, manila envelope, the sharp, clean edges of the papers cutting into his fingertips as he sealed the flap with a single, decisive strip of tape. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows of the tall, swaying bamboo crept slowly across his garden, Jerome slipped the envelope into his leather messenger bag, his broad shoulders squared, his dark eyes hard and unflinching as he stepped out onto his porch, the cool, night air filling his lungs as he took the first, slow step down the gravel path that led to the HOA clubhouse. He arrived early, the small, brightly lit room already buzzing with the low, nervous murmur of his neighbors as they gathered in tight, whispering clusters, their eyes flicking nervously toward the empty, high-backed chair at the front of the room, its polished wooden surface gleaming softly in the overhead fluorescent lights. Jerome took a seat near the back, his large, calloused hands resting calmly on the worn leather strap of his bag as he leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes scanning the crowd, his sharp, calculating mind already anticipating every possible outcome of the confrontation that was about to unfold. Finally, the door creaked open, and Karen swept into the room, her sharp, angular features twisted into a tight, thin-lipped smile as she took her place at the front of the room, her eyes flicking briefly over the assembled crowd before settling, with a faint, involuntary flicker of unease, on Jerome's calm, unblinking gaze. For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension as the quiet, nervous chatter of the crowd slowly faded into a strained, expectant silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, Jerome rose from his seat, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the polished tile floor as he reached into his bag, his fingers tightening around the thick, manila envelope as he made his way to the front of the room, his tall, broad frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the brightly lit podium where Karen sat, her sharp, blue eyes narrowing in thinly veiled suspicion as he approached. Without a word, Jerome placed the envelope on the polished wooden surface of the podium, his dark eyes never leaving Karen's as he slowly, deliberately slid the thick, heavy packet across the smooth, varnished wood, his fingers lingering for a brief, telling moment on the sharp, clean edge of the flap before releasing his grip and straightening to his full, imposing height. Karen hesitated, her thin, pale fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the envelope, her sharp, perfectly manicured nails scraping softly against the rough, textured paper as she slowly, cautiously pulled it toward her, her eyes flicking nervously between Jerome's unflinching stare and the thick, incriminating stack of documents that now lay before her. For a long, tense moment, the only sound in the room was the soft, whispering rustle of the papers as Karen flipped through the pages, her thin, trembling lips parting in a silent, gasping breath as her eyes widened in shock, her carefully constructed mask of superiority cracking, crumbling, shattering beneath the weight of the truth. Then, slowly, deliberately, Jerome leaned in, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air like a blade, his words sharp, precise, each syllable a carefully aimed blow. "This is over," he said, his voice low, steady, his dark eyes locked onto Karen's wide, frightened gaze. "You have no power here. Not anymore." With that, he turned on his heel, his broad shoulders squared, his head held high as he strode back down the center aisle, the quiet, stunned murmurs of the crowd rising in his wake as he pushed open the heavy, wooden door and stepped out into the cool, night air, his pulse still racing, his heart still pounding with the fierce, unshakable satisfaction of a battle hard won, a victory well earned. As he made his way down the quiet, shadowed street, the faint, distant sound of Karen's shocked, stuttering protests still echoing in his ears, Jerome felt a deep, unshakable sense of peace settle in his chest, his breath coming in slow, steady bursts as he stepped onto his porch, the thick, thorn-covered vines rustling gently in the cool, night breeze as he closed the door behind him, his sanctuary once more his own. And for the first time in weeks, Jerome smiled, his dark eyes gleaming with quiet, unspoken triumph as he sank into his favorite armchair, his rough, calloused hands resting calmly on the worn, leather arms as he leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the cool, whispering shadows of his garden envelop him once more.